Hello everyone! Today I have a video that I could not be more excited to bring to you, and that is my review for Nightside the Long Sun by Gene Wolfe, the first book in the overall Book of the Long Sun, which is a sub-series of his big solar cycle series. And now for years I've been calling this book Nightside of the Long Sun, and somebody very kindly on X pointed out to me that there's no of, it's just Nightside the Long Sun. And having finished the book now, I guess I can kind of see why, but I might need to ask some Wolfe people about that, because Wolfe is very precise with his words, and especially with the titles of things. So I'm assuming there's some deeper reason for this, but the Book of the Long Sun is very different from Book of the New Sun, which obviously is the series that comes before this, but is similar in some ways. So we're going to kind of talk about this, contrast it to Book of the New Sun, talk about ways that it is distinctly different, and why this might be an easier read for some people getting into New Sun, or getting into Gene Wolfe in general, than the Book of the New Sun is. So let's talk about what is Nightside the Long Sun about. So this book primarily follows a main character who's a young priest named Patera Silk. So Patera being their term for father, he is one day, while playing actually a ball game, receives a revelation, has this moment of enlightenment where his eyes are opened from a lesser-known god, a lesser-known deity that's called the Outsider. And this revelation, it's not clearly defined exactly what it is that is revealed to him, but it seems to be some sort of way out or solution from a coming destruction for his world is revealed to him in this moment. But on this same day, a local crime lord has seen a way that he can foreclose on and seize the priest's local church and school. And so he takes aggressive action to do so. And so Patera Silk decides to persuade him otherwise, whether he needs to use deadly force if necessary, or just persuade him with words to convince him to give them back their church and their school. And from there, the plot goes through all sorts of twists and turns. There's a big heist element to the story, but then it turns into eventually a murder mystery and has almost an exorcism element to the story. So one of the things that Gene Wolfe is known for doing is playing with genre conventions. So famously, in Book of the New Sun, much of it reads like a fantasy novel, but obviously by the time you get to the end, you realize this has been almost science fiction, dying Earth, by the end of it. In a similar way, Nightside the Long Sun presents itself as a science fiction novel. You've already read New Sun, so you know what type of world that you're in, and yet the actual plot of this reads very fantasy, like an ancient medieval tale. Murder mystery, exorcisms, priests, nuns, etc. But there's very much a lot more explicit sci-fi elements in this book, even more than there was in the Book of the New Sun. So we're going to compare these two a little bit here. The first thing that I'll say about this first installment in the Book of the Long Sun series is that Nightside the Long Sun is a much easier entry point than The Shadow of the Torturer is into the works of Gene Wolfe. It appears to be less dense. It also appears to be written in third person. We still are mainly following around one main character through this weird world, uncovering mysteries and different creatures and weird cultural traditions that are foreign and alien to the modern day reader. So there's similarities in that sense, but it being written in third person, there's some distinctive differences. Silk, the main character, the Patera, the priest, is a much more likable main character than Severian is. He has a very deeply grounded sense of morality and honesty, but as you would think of with a typical young priest character in these types of stories, Silk embodies a lot of that, a sense of virtue and caring for others and looking out for them and fulfilling the role that a good priest should. So even though you experience the world in a similar way, like you do with Book of the New Sun, the protagonist goes out, he encounters things, and we encounter them along with him. There's a lot less confusion, at least initially, in this book than there is in Book of the New Sun. In New Sun, Severian is very naive, has never been outside of the confines of a small part of the city and outside of the main citadel that he's lived in. But with this, Patera Silk is a little bit more worldly wise. He knows more of the world and environment that's around him. And so because of that, there's a lot less confusion about the things that he is encountering. There are some loose connections between the series. This is the second installment in the solar cycle. So you might think, like, how much of this is a direct sequel to New Sun? And at least up to this point, it doesn't appear to be much. So there's a few names that carry over where it's like, oh, I recognize that. There's even a few distinctive images from the Book of the New Sun that show up here. But one of the fascinating things is because this is set presumably quite a bit after Book of the New Sun, those images and the stories that back them up have very much changed over time. So things will be referenced from the Book of the New Sun, but the story will be a little bit off. They will have gotten some of the facts wrong. There's no Severian yet in this story, so we don't have like a cameo from him in Nightside the Long Sun. But his shadow, I say with a wink, his shadow looms large over this book. This book appears to be set, if you look at the cover of Nightside the Long Sun and the other installments in the Book of the Long Sun, this appears to be set on some sort of rendezvous with Rama, the end of Interstellar spaceship, where it is a spaceship that's like the size of a world that people live in. Now, I did not, and once again, this is my first time reading this book, and famously with Gene Wolfe, you pick up much more on your second read. You can still get a lot, and still have a lot of enjoyment out of your first read, which I did, but there's a lot of things that you will pick up on better your second read. And I did not pick up from the text of this book that, oh yes, this is very obviously rendezvous with Rama spaceship, interstellar spaceship. That's what all these people are living in. But that's what the covers show. That's what a lot of the fans say. So I kind of take their word for it. So the presumption being that at the end of the Book of the New Sun, keeping this vague here, Severian changes the world in drastic ways, in some very severe ways, which would have meant that some people from the world would probably have tried to leave. So my assumption is, and once again, this is not from the text of the book, that some of the people who are on this spaceship are human beings who left Earth after the events of Book of the New Sun and now are surviving somewhere out in the universe, and this spaceship is now their world. So we don't have any direct connection from like, oh, Severian's on the spaceship, but you kind of get the impression just from the setting that that is the result of things that happened in New Sun, even though it's not explicitly spelled out. I mentioned a second ago that in some ways this is more science fiction than Book of the New Sun. But in a similar way to New Sun, you have a fun element of trying to piece together what these pieces of technology are when they're not being used with the same descriptors that we use today. So for example, some of the nuns that Patera Silk interacts with, they're not called nuns, but that's basically what they are, appear to be robots, androids, non-living people. So you think about this, like you have some sort of priest, which we'll get to the religion part of this in a minute here, but these priests, which are pseudo-Catholic, pseudo-pagan priests, but they also interact with robot or android nuns, apparently. You also have, instead of using firearms, they use, archaic weapons, but also what seem to be needle guns that shoot needles at people. But the most fascinating, by far, is that people in their houses have what are called windows. It's not like you see through something. It appears to be some sort of technology, like a computer screen. And now that I'm saying this out loud, I wonder if, because Wolfe loves his puns, he loves his play on words, he loves hiding things in the words that he uses, I wonder if this is a reference to like Microsoft Windows. But it appears to be some sort of technology. People can communicate looking at one window. They can communicate with somebody who's at another window. There seems to be some sort of AI, some sort of sentience within the window that people can talk with and gain information from. So nowadays we'd obviously call that artificial intelligence. But one of the most weird things about this is that Patera Silk says that Pateras and priests of the past have encountered the gods through these windows, and that was how they communicated with them and interacted with them. So it's unclear whether the gods that are worshipped by Patera Silk and by the other people in this world, whether they're like spiritual beings who have been able to access this technology, or whether it's AI, whether it's something from the technology that is then being worshipped as gods. Now, Wolfe being the author, I have a few suspicions about that, but it is a fascinating element of world building. You also think about the application of contacting and receiving instruction from a god through windows. You think about this in the sense of, like, say, stained glass windows, where in the medieval ages, or in an age where most people aren't literate, the main way that you would learn the stories of Scripture or stories of the saints would be to see the stories depicted through art. And one of those big ways being in these large churches and cathedrals through stained glass windows. So that's another element to this whole windows apparatus that's really fascinating. And we'll touch on religion a little bit more here. So, like I said, there's an element of Catholicism, but also what I would call paganism that seem to have intermixed to create this religion. Or maybe it's just Catholicism with, like, the serial numbers sort of rubbed off here, because, you know, they have many of the positions that Catholics do. They use many of the same rites, like confession and exorcism, like I mentioned, and several other things. But they also seem to worship a pantheon. They have gods for different days of the week. They sacrifice animals to them. So there are some more pagan, superstitious elements that we have here. But they also have prayer beads, like Catholics do. And weirdly enough, and maybe my favorite element to this, of Wolfe just being like, you like that? Let me throw another monkey wrench in here. They also have mathematics as a part of the religion. So rather than, you know, making the sign of the cross, they make the sign of addition, or they make the sign of subtraction. And instead of having, like, spells or chants that the priests say, they are literally called formulas that the priests recite. Almost like a math formula. So there's this weird melding of science and religion into this one cohesive element that Patericilk is a part of. So I'm keeping this very spoiler vague because I want people to read this book. Like I said, I think this one is, on the surface, much more understandable and enjoyable than Shadow of the Torturer is on a first read. So if you pick up this novel and you just read it from cover to cover and put it down, you'll get a complete story. Shadow of the Torturer just kind of ends. And it ends almost mid-sentence in some ways. It ends certainly mid-action. There's not really a good breaking off point. Not so with Nightside the Long Sun. Nightside the Long Sun has a defined ending point. Now, it is just the first part of this longer quartet, so I'm sure there's much of the story that we still have to go. I'm sure that upon a reread, after I've gotten the context of all 4 books, this book will be very much recontextualized. But for this first read, this is a great novel just to start with. It's a very small novel in the sense that it probably covers 48 hours of time, not much time at all. We mainly follow this one main character, and even though there's a lot put into that 48 hours, it's much more contained and, I would say, easy to grasp in terms of the plot-by-plot beats than, say, Shadow of the Torturer. So somebody commented on one of my older Gene Wolfe videos and said, it's not that the Book of the New Sun is confusing. It's that there's confusing scenes in it. So the overall plot isn't difficult to get a handle on, but there are different elements that can be. And I think that's probably right. And with Nightside the Long Sun, I found that there was much less individual scenes that were actually confusing or that tripped me up, like there was the first time that I read Shadow of the Torturer. There is a lot of world building questions that I have going forward, but I didn't find this one quite as dense as the Shadow of the Torturer was. Wolfe does something in this novel which is sort of, I'm almost starting to see this as a repeating thing for him, which is he takes things that are very old and then he presents them in a new way. So he takes the old and he makes it new. So if you were to present sort of the bare bones of this plot where you have priests and churches and murder mystery and exorcism, it sounds like a medieval tale. It sounds like a classical old medieval tale, like something written by Umberto Eco or Chesterton that would be made into like a Ridley Scott movie. But yeah, this is set in the far future and presumably out in space. And there's, like I said, a lot of weird tech that plays a part in this story. So by taking those old things and putting them in a new context, it sort of breathes new life into it. Makes you think about it in a different way. And now when we're approaching things like exorcism, and he's using terms like people being possessed, you start to wonder, how much is technology playing a part in here? Is this just straightforward spiritual stuff? But obviously it's not, because we're not in the same context that, say, a story set in the Middle Ages would have been. So anyway, it makes for a really, really engaging and interesting read. If people find the Book of the New Sun dense or off-putting, I recommend picking this one up. Now maybe some Wolfe fans would get upset at that, or that would ruffle some people's feathers, but I think that this is a very good start to his style that will ease you in a little bit more than maybe some of his other stuff will. Now this isn't the most in-depth review I've ever given. This is more of an initial reaction to this first book, but I really enjoyed it. I can't wait to reread it once I've gotten all the way to the end and see if anything changes. But at least on a first read, this is a really excellent novel. As you would expect with Wolfe, the line-by-line prose is excellent. His sense of pacing is really good, probably better even than it was in New Sun, just the pacing. I don't know, at least on a first read, that I like this quite as much as New Sun, but right now New Sun holds a very special place in my heart, so it would definitely need to take some time for this to overtake New Sun. But if you've read the Book of the New Sun and Earth of the New Sun and you weren't sure about continuing on, I can say you should. You should continue on. I think Wolfe has evolved as a writer since those books. I think you can actually see that in the text itself. This is a very different story, but there's enough there as a Wolfe fan that I think you'll really enjoy it. I enjoyed this probably even more than I enjoyed The Shadow of the Torturer on my first read. So anyway, we're going to go on to Lake of the Long Sun, which is book 2 in the overall Book of the Long Sun, very soon in this upcoming month. This is definitely going to be a high priority series for me moving forward, because I've missed Gene Wolfe. I've missed reading these books by him. Sometimes you need to read other things, but I've definitely been feeling the hankering to get back to Wolfe's writing and the way he writes and the way he constructs puzzles and plays with different ideas. I've been missing that recently, so it's good to be back, and it's good to know that Nightside of the Long Sun is at least at quality, if not possibly better, depending on how the next books go, than Book of the New Sun was. So, guys, if you haven't read this, give it a shot. If you have read Book of the New Sun, especially, you should continue on to this. And if anybody started reading the Solar Cycle books with Book of the Long Sun, I'd be interested to know what your experience was. So anyway, guys, thank you so much for watching this video. I will see you in the next one. Take care.